Welcome back to Sinister Chronicles, where darkness unfolds. Today, we dive into the gripping tale of 9 Steps, a novel of justice, obsession, and unrelenting vengeance. Get ready, because once you step in, there's no turning back. Chapter 1. The countdown begins. The rain hammered down on the streets, turning the neon lights of the city into smeared streaks of color on the wet asphalt. Detective Grace Elman adjusted her coat collar against the cold spray as she stepped under the police tape. The smell hit her first, coppery, rancid, and mingled with something faintly floral. Lavender, maybe. It didn't belong here. "Over here, Detective," Officer Ruiz called, his voice tight. His flashlight beam hovered over the body slumped against a graffiti-stained wall. Grace crouched beside the corpse, a middle-aged man, his face contorted in terror, eyes frozen open. A single Roman numeral, I, had been carved into his forehead. "What do we know?" Grace asked, snapping on gloves. "Wallet's missing, no ID," Ruiz said. "But look at this." He handed her a folded piece of parchment, its edges curling from the damp. Grace unfolded it carefully, revealing an elegant, handwritten note. Step 1. The liar repents. Justice begins with truth. Step 1, Grace muttered. "What the hell does that mean?" Ruiz shrugged, shifting uncomfortably. "There's more, Detective. Follow me." She stood and followed him deeper into the alley. At the end, illuminated by the harsh beam of a floodlight, was a tableau that made her stomach churn. A mirror leaned against the brick wall, its surface smeared with the victim's blood. Words were scrawled in jagged letters, 9 Steps to Redemption. Chapter 2. Patterns in the Chaos. Back at the precinct, Grace paced in front of the evidence board. Photos of the crime scene were pinned in place, connected by threads of string like a spider's web. The Roman numeral 1, the bloodied mirror, the note. It all felt calculated, deliberate. Her partner, Detective Sean Brody, sat at his desk, flipping through case files. "Serial killer," he said flatly. "This has got all the hallmarks." "It's not just a killer," Grace said. "It's a message. 9 Steps to Redemption. He's playing God." Brody snorted. "Every psycho with a manifesto thinks they're God." Before Grace could respond, her phone buzzed. The number was blocked. She hesitated, then answered. "Detective Elman." A distorted voice crackled through the line. "You're on the right path, Detective. But are you willing to follow it?" Grace's grip tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" "Step 2 awaits," the voice continued, ignoring her question. "The thief must pay the price. Look in the city's heart." The line went dead. Grace slammed the phone down, her pulse racing. "Trace that call," she barked at a tech officer nearby. Turning to Brody, she added, "City's heart. He's sending us somewhere." Chapter 3. Step 2. Grace and Brody arrived at Liberty Plaza just after midnight. The rain had eased, leaving the city slick and gleaming under the streetlights. A small crowd had gathered near the fountain, murmuring in hushed tones. Uniformed officers worked to cordon off the area. "What do we have?" Brody asked an officer. "Another body," the officer replied grimly. "It's bad." Grace pushed through the crowd, her stomach nodding as she reached the fountain. A young woman lay sprawled across the stone edge, her lifeless eyes staring skyward. Her wrists were bound with rope, and a gaping wound marred her abdomen. Beside her, etched into the wet stone, was the Roman numeral 2. In her lap rested another note, identical in style to the first. Step 2. The thief is unmasked. Justice demands sacrifice. Grace's mind raced. A liar and now a thief. The killer was choosing his victims based on perceived sins, enacting some twisted form of moral retribution. She could feel the noose tightening, the killer's game pulling her deeper into its web. Chapter 4: Threads Unraveling. Back at the precinct, the tension in the air was palpable. Grace stared at the evidence board, now dominated by 2 crime scene photos. The middle-aged man with eye carved into his forehead, and the young woman with 2 eye etched nearby. 2 victims, 2 sins. The notes taunted her, the killer's precise handwriting an eerie constant. The liar, the thief. "What's next?" Brody asked, standing beside her. His voice was low, weighed down by the gravity of the case. Grace shook her head. "We're dealing with someone who's methodical, possibly delusional, but incredibly disciplined. This isn't random. These victims were chosen." "Victims," Brody repeated. "So what connects them? What makes them guilty in his eyes?" Ruiz knocked on the glass wall of the conference room. "Detectives, got something." He placed a file on the table and opened it. The guy from the alley. His name was Douglas Hargrove. Used to work at a finance company downtown. Fired 2 years ago for falsifying reports. Grace leaned in. "The liar," Ruiz nodded. "Exactly. And the woman, Dana Caldwell, arrested for shoplifting 6 months ago. Case was dismissed, but she's the thief," Brody finished grimly. "This guy's not just picking random sinners. He's judging them. Serial killers don't just wake up one day and start carving Roman numerals into people," Grace said. "There's a history here. We need to find it." Chapter 5: Step 3. The call came just after dawn. Another blocked number, another distorted voice. "You're falling behind, Detective. Step 3 has already begun." This time, the call wasn't just a message, it was a location. Grace and Brody sped across town, sirens wailing as they approached the derelict warehouse. The building loomed against the gray morning sky, its broken windows like jagged teeth. Inside, the stench hit them immediately. Sweat, blood, decay. They found him hanging by his wrists from the ceiling beams, a man in his 40s, his body battered and broken. His face was swollen, almost unrecognizable, but the Roman numeral 3 had been carved into his chest. Grace scanned the room, her flashlight catching movement on the far wall. A projector hummed, playing a looped video against the peeling paint. On the screen, the victim, still alive in the footage, sobbed as he confessed to abusing his wife and children. The killer's voice, distorted and cold, prodded him. "Admit your sin. Only then will you find peace." The note was pinned to the victim's shirt. Step 3. The abuser is silenced. Justice restores balance. Chapter 6. The clock ticks. The case hit the media within hours. Reporters swarmed the precinct, their headlines splashing across screens. 9 steps to redemption. The city's moral avenger. "This is bad," Brody muttered as he flipped through the morning news. "He's getting exactly what he wants, an audience." Grace was already moving. "We need to get ahead of him. Ruiz, pull every case file from the past 5 years. Domestic abuse, fraud, theft, anything that fits his pattern." "It'll take hours," Ruiz protested. "Then start now," she snapped. By midday, they had a list. 37 names. 37 potential victims. "This doesn't help us narrow it down," Brody said, rubbing his temples. "Even if we figure out the sins, we're still playing his game." Grace stared at the evidence board, her mind racing. "Number. We're missing something. Look at the notes. Each one isn't just about the crime. It's about justice, his version of it. What if the victims aren't random but connected by the way they avoided punishment? Brody frowned. You think they all got away with it? She nodded. Hargrove falsified reports and walked away with severance. Caldwell's shoplifting case was dismissed. The abuser? Maybe he was never charged. He's targeting people who escaped accountability. But how does he know? Brody asked. What's his source? Grace hesitated. That's what we need to find out. Ruiz, cross-reference those names with dismissed charges, dropped cases, anything that fits. Chapter 7. Step 4. The killer didn't give them time to finish their search. The next crime scene was a playground, cordoned off with yellow tape as parents and children huddled in the rain, their faces pale with shock. The victim was a woman in her 30s. Her body posed on a park bench. A toy doll lay in her lap, its face smeared with her blood. The Roman numeral 4 was scrawled on the bench beside her. The note pinned to the doll read, Step 4. The neglectful learns regret. Justice for the forgotten. She was a social worker, Ruiz reported later, handing Grace a file. Name's Lila Cartwright, recently under investigation for negligence in a child welfare case. Kid died in foster care on her watch. Grace felt the weight of the killer's message pressing down on her. He's escalating. These crimes are getting bolder, more public. And we still have no idea who he is, Brody said. Grace glanced at the evidence board, her eyes narrowing. Not yet. But he's leaving us clues. We just have to find them. Chapter 8. Patterns and Parallels. Hours turned into days. The killer struck again and again, each victim tied to a perceived sin. A corrupt politician, a drug dealer who sold to minors, a doctor accused of malpractice. Each murder was a spectacle, a message etched in blood. Grace barely slept, her mind consumed by the killer's twisted logic. She pored over every note, every symbol, searching for the thread that connected it all. Then she found it. The notes, she said suddenly, startling Brody. The handwriting. What about it? It's not just elegant, it's old-fashioned, like someone who was taught to write decades ago, maybe even in a private or religious school. Brody nodded slowly. Okay, so we're looking for someone older, maybe with a strict upbringing. That narrows it down. Not just older, Grace said. Look at the language he uses. Repents. Justice demands sacrifice. Redemption. This is someone deeply religious, or at least someone who used to be. Brody frowned. A former priest, maybe? Or someone with ties to the church? Grace grabbed her phone. Let's find out. Chapter 9. The Final Step. By the time they traced the killer's identity, it was too late. The final step had already been set in motion. Grace and Brody arrived at the abandoned cathedral just as the clock struck midnight. The killer had left the doors wide open, as if inviting them inside. The nave was empty, save for a single chair in the center of the room. A man was tied to it, his head slumped forward. Blood pooled beneath him, forming the Roman numeral 9. Grace stepped closer, her flashlight revealing the killer's final message, scrawled on the wall in crimson. Step 9. The judge is judged. Justice is eternal. Where is he? Brody whispered, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. A shadow moved behind them. Grace spun around, her gun drawn, but the killer was already gone, leaving behind only his twisted legacy. Chapter 10. The Aftermath. The crime scene at the cathedral left more questions than answers. The man in the chair, Edward Langston, was a retired judge, known for dismissing several high-profile criminal cases on technicalities. His face was serene in death, a cruel irony considering the chaos surrounding him. Grace stood frozen in the middle of the nave, staring at the bloodied message on the wall. Brody's voice broke her trance. "Grace, we've got to call this in. This whole place is—" She held up a hand to silence him, her eyes scanning the scene. Something felt off. The killer had been meticulous at every step, but this setup was different, less precise, rushed. "Wait," she said, walking toward the body. She crouched down, studying Langston's wounds. The carving of 9 was rough, as though done hastily, lacking the clean precision of the previous markings. "This isn't him," she said quietly. Brody frowned. "What do you mean?" "It's staged," Grace said, rising. "The killer didn't do this. Someone else finished his work, or tried to." The sound of a police siren grew louder outside, signaling the arrival of backup. Grace turned to Brody, her expression grim. "This isn't the final step. Not yet." Chapter 11. The 10th Message. Back at the precinct, Grace pored over the evidence again. The killer had always been deliberate, his actions aligned with a deeper purpose. This new scene felt like an imitation, but why? The tech team had managed to decrypt a hidden file on one of the victims' phones. It was an email thread between several of the targets: Hargrove, Caldwell, Cartwright, and now Langston. The subject line read, "Investments in Redemption." "Look at this," Grace said, pointing to the screen. They all knew each other. They were part of some kind of group. Brody leaned over her shoulder. "What kind of group?" "Redemption," Grace said, scrolling through the emails. "It looks like a private organization. They claimed to help people who'd been accused of crimes, offered legal help, financial aid. But look closer." She pointed to a transaction log. They were taking payments, big ones. Brody's face darkened. So they were profiting off protecting criminals. They weren't just guilty, they were complicit. "And the killer knew," Grace said. "That's why he chose them. But Langston didn't fit the pattern. Someone else wanted him dead for another reason. This isn't over." Her phone buzzed, a blocked number flashing on the screen. She answered, her voice steady. "This is Detective Elman." The distorted voice crackled through the line. "You see the truth now, don't you, Detective? Step 9 wasn't mine. Someone has tainted the path." Grace's grip tightened. "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" The voice ignored her questions. "Justice cannot be rushed. Meet me where the sinner's journey began." The line went dead. Chapter 12. The Confessional. Grace and Brody drove to the first crime scene, the alley where Douglas Hargrove's body was found. The rain had started again, soft but insistent, soaking the already damp city streets. The alley was quiet, cordoned off with yellow tape that fluttered in the wind. Grace stepped under the tape, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Why here?" Brody asked, following close behind. "He said this was where it began," Grace replied. "This is his starting point. Maybe he left something we missed." They moved slowly, scanning every inch of the alley. Grace's flashlight landed on a metal grate near the wall. Something glinted beneath it. She crouched down, prying the grate loose. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal. She opened it carefully, the pages filled with handwritten notes in the same elegant script as the killer's messages. It was a manifesto of sorts, detailing his philosophy of justice and redemption. One passage caught her eye. "The righteous must guide the lost. If I falter, the path must be followed to its conclusion." "This is his plan," Grace said, holding up the journal. "He's not just killing. He's creating a doctrine, A movement. A faint noise echoed down the alley. A slow, deliberate clap. Grace and Brody spun around, their guns drawn. A man stepped out of the shadows, his face obscured by the brim of a dark hat. "You've done well, Detective," he said, his voice calm and unfiltered. "Few have understood my work as deeply as you." "Drop the act," Grace snapped. "Hands where I can see them." The man raised his hands, stepping closer. His face came into view, older, with sharp features and piercing eyes. He looked nothing like the frenzied image Grace had painted in her mind. "I am not your enemy," he said. "I am merely the messenger." Chapter 13. The Revelation. The man introduced himself as Dr. Harold Kane, a former psychologist who had spent decades working with criminal offenders. He claimed that his actions were meant to expose a broken system, to force society to reckon with its failures. "Do you know how many times I tried to fix them?" Kane said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "To reform the liars, the abusers, the thieves, it doesn't work. True justice requires action." "And murder," Grace said, her voice cold. "Justice," Kane corrected. "I only did what the system refuses to do." Brody stepped forward. "If that's true, then why kill Langston? He didn't fit your pattern." Kane's expression hardened. "I didn't kill Langston. That was someone else, someone trying to undermine my work." Grace held up the journal. "You left this for me. Why?" Kane smiled faintly. "Because I knew you'd understand. You see the cracks in the system, Detective. You've spent your life fighting a losing battle. But together, we could..." The crack of a gunshot cut him off. Kane stumbled back, blood blooming across his chest. Grace turned, spotting a figure on the rooftop above the alley, a rifle trained on their position. "Sniper!" Brody shouted, tackling Grace to the ground. Chapter 14. The Final Step. The shooter escaped before the officers could reach the rooftop, leaving behind no trace except for a single spent shell casing. Kane was rushed to the hospital, but his injuries were severe. Before he lost consciousness, he whispered one final word to Grace. 10. The word haunted her as she pieced together the case in the days that followed. Someone else had taken up Kane's mantle, using his philosophy as a blueprint for their own twisted agenda. The 9th victim had been a deviation, but the 10th would be the culmination. Grace knew one thing for certain. She was the target. The killer's final step wasn't about a specific sin. It was about the enforcer of justice, the one who hunted sinners but could never escape her own flaws. As she prepared for the inevitable confrontation, Grace couldn't shake the question that had lingered since the first note. What is justice? And how far would she go to find it? Thanks for joining us on this journey into the shadows. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories from the dark corners of the world, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Sinister Chronicles. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. And remember, once you step in, there is no turning back.